It's going to be a slightly different session than other sessions you've done. We've had to change this into a fireside chat. Tammy and Jacob have a ton of great information to share. So no slides on this one, but lots of great conversation. All right, and there'll be time for Q&A. So with that, I talked through the warm-up time. But you all should be warmed up by now, because I'm sure you've all been in our breakout sessions. So. Big warm round of applause for Tammy Burnitt and Jacob Brown. So they're here to present Deciphering Azure Amortized Cost Dataset. So Tammy, Jacob, please introduce yourself.
After you.
Absolutely. So my name is Jacob Brown. I am a business analyst / software engineer at Shell, and I've been a part of our FinOps program for 4 years now. Mm-hmm. And basically what I do every day is I stare at the cost and usage data set and try to extract as many insights from it as feasibly possible. And in that capacity, very excited to speak about the amortized cost data set, and the room over there is very excited as well.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
They overheard you.
They did.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm Tammy Burnitt. I am the Senior IT FinOps Manager at Shell Oil Company. I've been with the company for about 14 years, and I'm based out of Houston, Texas. I founded the FinOps program at Shell about 4 years ago in the community of practice. I'm a FinOps practitioner, and I'm currently enrolled in the FinOps professional course, slated to complete that sometime in August. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So Tammy, tell us about, just set the stage. What's your FinOps team look like?
Well, if you look at it as like 3 pillars, we have a group of practitioners. There's about 7-8 people on my team. So a portion of those folks handle the day-to-day FinOps practitioner. So it's cost optimization, it's managing commitment usage discounts, looking for ways to digitalize and automate. Then we have another group of folks like Jacob. We have business analysts. Their sole responsibility is to mine data, create those data pipelines, connect those APIs, pull all the data in, and create that specific BI analytic data that we need to go and drive down the spend and really steer those cloud consumers and make them good, conscientious cloud consumers based on the data. And then the third pillar we have is our cloud health platform. That's the tool that we use to manage. We're in multi-cloud at Shell. And that is a tooling lead for Cloud Health. So his sole responsibility is to make sure that tool is up and evergreened and build the reports necessary to drive our multi-cloud initiative at Shell.
That's really cool how you have it broken down into pillars. Are they all reporting up into the same reporting structure, or is it more of a matrix style?
So the FinOps team, we're a little decentralized at Shell. So our FinOps organization that I just talked about it's spread across regionally, the US, and Bangalore. And then we have a broader, what we call a Cloud Center of Excellence, or a broader FinOps organization, and that's comprised of our FinOps team. We've got a finance organization, as probably most companies do. We've got a portfolio team, and they're responsible for setting the strategy for the cloud, negotiating the contracts for the cloud. And they work closely with FinOps on forecasting and making sure that we're on target where we need to be spend-wise. We also have a digital platform, service operations management. They're responsible for making sure the cloud is up and it is secure and executing a lot of the initiatives for the day-to-day cloud, but also a lot of the initiatives coming out of the FinOps space, such as commitment usage discounts. So they'll procure those, but they have to work very closely with the FinOps team as we have to go through regular normalization and things like that. So it's a broader team. And then we usually have one business representative from each of our groups at Shell. We have a trading, downstream, upstream, global functions and projects. So it's a pretty big, broad group, and it's spread out regionally.
That sounds really impressively integrated.
Yeah.
You mentioned the committed usage discounts, right? Purchasing. Can you talk about the Azure commitment usage
I know, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Absolutely. So we have our Azure Strategy, or we call it our strategic intent for commitment usage discounts. It's enterprise, so first come, first served basis. We want to make sure we buy those at the enterprise level. It's typically a 3-year because most family types are offered in more regions for a 3-year. And then we go through, if you looked at it kind of like as a continuous cycle, so there's enterprise 3-year, then you're going to analyze, and then we normalize and we start that process over. It's not even monthly, it's probably sometimes weekly or even daily. We're a big company and we do get some demand, but then there's just sometimes you have to stop and anticipate, okay, either they're not telling us what they're gonna do or You want to make sure you kind of maintain that normalization level, but in a company the size of Shell, it really takes a lot of effort to make sure that you can maintain those targets. But that's kind of what our broader team does.
You still wake up to some surprises of dips of coverage?
Well, yeah, you do. I mean, it's frequently. So yeah.
So that's a challenge. So what are some of the challenges you've seen with this strategy?
Well, I think it's about striking a balance. I think, your normalization levels, they require constant analysis, right? So I think with shared subscriptions, there's another challenge there on chargebacks, and Jacob's going to talk a lot about that. Before you can go into a program like that, you need to make sure you have a chargeback mechanism. You need to kind of understand how you're going to handle any commitment usage discount that's not been consumed, right? You need to decide if you're going to equitably charge those back, or if you're just going to divide them up and split the difference. But I think, the challenges there are, I don't think there's a right answer. It's just coming up with, what is your strategy? How do you plan to implement it? How do you plan to charge it back, right? And then how do you handle anything that's unused? I mean, it's negligible at Shell, but it's still something that we have to discuss and figure out how we're going to build that back in advance.
So what's really interesting, and I've really enjoyed working with you both on this presentation, because Azure is I am least experienced in Azure in the major clouds. So I've gotten to learn a lot about this, and I was firing follow-up questions to Jacob over the weekend. So there's an amortized cost data set and an actual cost data set, right? Can you talk about the differences between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to mention for those that might be potentially not within Azure, the good news about the clouds is that they all copy each other as much as possible. And because of that, a lot of the concepts that we'll talk about together actually kind of apply to the other clouds in many ways as well. But specifically, we're talking about the Azure side of the equation. So you have two big data sets in Azure. You have your actual costs and you have your amortized costs. And both of these are gigantic Excels that you can download from your cost management portal in Azure. So if you go into the website and you download the file, you will see a gigantic list of all your virtual machines, all your services, et cetera. So we're going to start to explain the difference between the two data sets. We're going to start really simple just for a second. So what each of these data sets represents is it's showing specifically for a specific day, for a specific virtual machine in a specific subscription, how much that virtual machine used of whatever metric it's being billed upon, and specifically how much you're being charged for that usage. So that is what a single line in this gigantic Excel that is the cost and usage file shows you. And the difference between the amortized cost data set and the actual cost data set is very specifically that the cost that is shown in the amortized cost data set is the prorated cost for the reservation usage for that specific instance. That is the technical definition, which makes no sense to me when I first read it online, but essentially what you have is for a specific line in the Excel, you have virtual machine A on July 1st was charged this amount of money. And the actual data set, you will see a charge, if there is a reservation present, of a charge of 0, because the reservation is entirely discounting that virtual machine. In contrast, in the amortized cost data set, you will see that exact same line with the exact same column. So virtual machine A on July 1st for subscription A, but instead you will see a charge for maybe $17. And that cost is the cost of the reservation that this virtual machine is supposed to pay. And that fundamental concept that you're seeing exactly the cost that a specific resource is using of the reservation as a whole is what primarily the amortized data set is for. And besides that difference and a few other little edge cases, they are basically the same Excel document. In fact, you can compare them line by line together and they will look exactly the same, with the exception of that cost column being just a little bit different.
All right, so actual cost has the VMs have
Yes.
0 cost, but the amortized cost has the prorated cost of how much of the reservation that they use?
Exactly.
Okay, got it. So they're the data sets are showing the same thing as amortized is showing the same thing as actual. They should use different words, not to get away from the alliteration. It's hard for presenters. So how do you use those two data sets together?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the basic idea is that if you are interested in anything besides reservations, you really want to use the actual cost data set. Mm-hmm. If you are interested in understanding what the heck your reservations are doing, you can use the amortized cost data set to understand their behavior a little bit better. The amortized cost data set was primarily created to explain the crazy world that is reservations. So I can't really see because of the lights coming in, but just looking out on the audience, I would imagine a lot of people are exploring supplier discounts, maybe really expanding their coverage rates. And one of the things that we have all encountered is that reservations make absolutely no sense. They are extremely difficult to understand how they're working. And in fact, if you choose to go for shared reservations like we have done in our company, reservations can hop between different subscriptions almost as if they have a mind of their own. And in fact, they do. There's a whole machine algorithm behind which reservations specifically apply to which specific resources. And the amortized cost data set is Microsoft's way of making it just a little bit easier to understand what behavior reservations are doing. So back to your question, Joe, specifically, one of the things you want to ask is, how can these different data sets relate to each other a little bit? And so how can you see the cost for a reservation that you would see in the actual cost data set? How can you see that exact same cost in the amortized? Because they're the same data, there should be some way of seeing the same information. So specifically what you can do is for a month time period, so you filter down to the month column and you select a specific month. And then you go into the column that indicates which reservation is discounting specific resources. You filter that down to a specific reservation ID. Then, if you sum all of the costs in the amortized data set, the costs that you see summed up will exactly equal the cost of the reservation for that month. That is a way of relating the two data sets together. So in other words, just to say it again in plain English, the basic idea is that you can see the cost for a reservation on a monthly basis broken down by the individual resources. And if you sum all of those charges up, you see the actual costs of the reservation itself.
And you mentioning shared reservations really helps make that clear for me, because I would want to know if I was doing a chargeback or showback, I'd want to know where the reservation is getting applied, because you may have subscriptions that are specific to different departments.
That is a primary use case of the amortized data set. In fact, without the amortized data set, it is virtually impossible to tell from the cost and usage data set which specific subscriptions are being charged for which specific reservations. So
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So Tammy, what are some limiting considerations about using the amortized cost data set?
Well, as Jacob mentioned, the amortized cost data set is specifically designed for commitment usage discounts. It's not going to show you any kind of amortized costs for any other services. It's specifically designed to give you insight for your commitment usage discount, right? Or it could be RI, could be a savings plan down the line. Also, as I mentioned earlier, and Jacob's probably going to allude to this further in his talk, you've got that situation of, well, how do I handle anything that was unused? The amortized data set is not going to tell you how to do that. Right? It's just going to show you what portion was unused. So as I mentioned earlier, when you're coming up with a strategy on how to implement your commitment usage discounts, those are all considerations. You know, anything, you have the amortized data set to charge back what was used, but you need to kind of come into that with an understanding. And again, what I didn't mention before is you got to sell this to your C-suite. I can't recommend that enough. It's building a business case and getting the buy-in and getting a trusted partner and kind of coming along and saying, here's what you're paying for your contracted spend, right? And then some of these RIs, they come with, an additional 50, 60, 70% discount on top of whatever your contracted spend discount is. So it's really good to get a trusted partner to go in there and sell it. But before you sell it, you need to make sure you have all the mechanisms in the back end to support it, right? But those are primarily the two biggest limitations. Is anything that's unused, you want to know how you're going to build that back going in, or you're just going to split the difference and divide it amongst everyone. And then again, that data set is only for commitment usage discount data.
So it sounds simple, but it also sounds really complicated. So Jacob, could you break down how you would calculate your Azure savings?
Yeah, absolutely.
RI savings, yeah.
Absolutely. So any business that encounters reservations for the first time is blown away by the fact that you can save 40 to 60% of your compute spend just using reservations, which is amazing. For most businesses, this is probably the largest cost lever that exists in large part. Companies will then purchase reservations. They will log into the Azure portal to see how they're operating and how they're discounting their costs. And then they ask a very simple question: how much am I saving? And immediately you hit a brick wall, because there is no way in the Azure portal, in fact, to see the amount that you are saving on your Azure reservations. So we want to break down the concept a little bit into a way that's easy to understand. So with the amortized data set, calculating savings is a very straightforward calculation. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to take as a general concept, you want to take the amount of money that you would have paid without a reservation, and you want to subtract that from the amount of money that you did pay with the reservation. And when you subtract that from each other, you get the actual savings that you incurred. And the way that you actually calculate that in the amortized data set is there is a column that is labeled quantity. So if you just search for the Excel column that's labeled quantity, that is the amount of the usage that you incurred. And you multiply that quantity column by a column called unit price, which is the amount that you would have paid without the reservation. So you multiply unit price by quantity, you get the amount that you would have paid for the reservation if you weren't using the reservation. And then you subtract that from the cost column. And that is quite literally how every single software vendor and everyone who's talking about these calculations calculates it, just taking these three columns and subtracting it from each other. So to answer your question, Joe.
That's good. So talk us through alternative virtual machine calculations.
Yeah, so separate from the calculation of savings, there is also the question of how much of my estate is actually being covered by reservations. So when you're actually talking with your leadership, you want to be able to say 80%, 75%, 60% of my estate is actually being covered by these reservations. And again, the calculation of this is unfortunately not inconsequential. It's not something that you can easily see just directly in the portal. And as a result, you can do a little bit of a calculation yourself. So the specifics that we want to give as an example here is for virtual machines specifically. So what you want to do to calculate your coverage percentage for virtual machines is you take the meter category, which is another column that exists in the amortized data set, and you filter it down to virtual machines. And at that point, you are only looking at your usage for virtual machines. At that point, all you have to do is sum up the quantities that exist in the quantity column to get the number of hours that was run not on reservations, and you divide that by the sum of the quantities that don't exist with the reservation attached. And from there, you can calculate very easily the amount of virtual machine coverage you had.
Is that a common KPI that you're tracking, your coverage?
Absolutely. It's in fact, if I didn't have poor eyesight and I wasn't blinded, I would be able to potentially see some nodding heads. It is very important to keep track of your level of coverage, and a lot of people use third-party vendors, but if you wanted to do it yourself, that is how you do it.
Awesome. So what are two key takeaways when analyzing these costs?
Yeah, so one of the things that you can take away from the way that I'm speaking about this subject is that it's really important when you consider things like supplier discounts, savings plans, reservations, these a little bit more complicated metrics to ask really deep-hitting questions about what actually goes into the calculation. It's really important to ask your third-party provider or the team that you're working with what the specific math is that they're using to calculate this specific metric. When you go to your leadership, it should be possible for you to say, I know my coverage is this amount, and be ready to answer the question of asking if they, like how is this calculated? What actually goes into this calculation specifically? So the first takeaway is always ask questions about the algorithms behind your calculations. And the second thing that I would recommend with this data set is you really want to try to calculate everything in multiple ways. So we've mentioned the fact that the cost and usage data set is very similar to the amortized data set. And in fact, you can see the data from one represented in the other. It's always important to confirm your understanding of the numbers that you're seeing in one data set by playing with the other and seeing if you can mirror and match them. And by doing so, you really increase your knowledge of reservations in general.
That's interesting. So we focused on the amortization data set cost. How does savings plans come into this?
Yeah,
absolutely.
absolutely.
How have you been integrating those reserved instances with savings plans?
So as everyone who has checked out savings plans for Azure knows, savings plans has upended everyone in regards to Azure. So as an introduction for savings plans, they're actually changing the way that reservations operate by the end of this calendar year. And are really, Microsoft in general is making it a lot easier for people to purchase coverage options that work with a larger variety of different instance families and region groups with savings plans. The good news, though, is that if you were to look at the documentation for savings plans online and compare it with the documentation for reservation IDs, you would notice that they're eerily similar. In fact, they oftentimes just copied and pasted the actual documentation. So in other words, what is actually happening is savings plans work with the amortized cost data set in the exact same way that reservations do. So as your company transitions to savings plans, the columns that you're referencing might be slightly different in terms of name, but the actual concepts themselves apply directly.
That's awesome.
So
I'm going to open it up here. I'm going to come off the stage, and we can take some questions from the audience. Who has a question first? Here we go.
I guess.
Thank you for the talk. Great content. This is a weird question. How do you feel about the name of the amortized data set? Because, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar, right? If you don't have any upfront reservations, right, there's no amortization happening as we know it through GAAP, right? It's just spreading out the pay-as-you-go shared subscriptions to the consuming subscriptions, right? Or shared reservations to the consuming subscriptions. And that causes problems, I mean, especially if you're multi-cloud, when AWS, the amortization is just upfront, right? So, yeah, what are your thoughts?
it's a great question, and the amortized data set is confusingly named for a couple of different reasons, including the one that you mentioned. And you bring up an excellent point, which is, say I am purchasing all upfront reservations, why would I even care about the amortized data set? And the important thing to mention here is that, this is probably best explained with a little simple example. So say you have 15 different virtual machines. They're all different sizes. It's very hard to keep track of virtual machine sizes and their behaviors. And they're all being discounted by 3 different reservations that are discounting them at different rates on different days. What the amortized data set, to your question, allows you to do is it allows you to say very specifically on a specific day, say June 1st or June 2nd, that a specific reservation was charging this specific virtual machine for an X amount of money, which means on that day, when you're doing your chargeback process, that virtual machine needs to be charged back that amount of money for its reservation usage. So in other words, you have like 15 virtual machines. The first one is responsible for 30% of the cost, 20% of the cost, 10% of the cost, so on and so forth. And it's a great question because it doesn't appear like you need amortization with upfront information, but the fact that the amortization isn't just occurring on the day-to-day basis, the amortization as a concept is occurring on the resource level itself is where the real power lies. So fantastic question, by the way.
I'm curious in your analysis if you've been able to determine the order that the reserved instances or savings plans are applied to the resources, which is first.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is a really excellent one because it really hits on like how can you understand the behavior of reservations versus savings plans, right? And the basic idea is, while I once asked Microsoft to if I could see the actual algorithm that they use for it, and they showed me this like 40-page sheet that was incredibly large. But the basic idea that I took away from that exercise was that very simply, the first thing that will apply to your resource is the thing that will save you the most money. Yeah, and so in other words, the basic idea is if the savings plan is going to save you the most money, that's the thing you'll see first. If the reservation is going to save you the most money, that's the thing you'll see first. But to answer your question in a little bit of another way, it's usually the case that if you have both of them, reservations and savings plans, you'll probably see the reservation first. And that's because in the introduction of the savings plan concept, one of the things that Azure did is they, while they do offer savings plans save at a reduced rate in comparison to reservations, which means that a lot of third-party providers at the moment are actually thinking that to really optimize your estate, so to speak, it might actually make sense to get a combination of reservations and savings plans, kind of similar to the AWS side of things. But excellent question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask regarding the difference between the actual and amortized. So correct me if I'm wrong, but with the amortized data set, if you say just filtered in a manner where you just checked if reservation ID was null, you'd be able to obtain all the data that's not about reservations as well, right? So can you give me a use case that you would only be able to do something using the actual data set that you wouldn't be able to do the amortized data set? Like, is there a single thing that any business reason, anything that I would actually need the actual data set at all?
So it's a really excellent question. So to be honest, almost everything you can do in the amortized data set. The reason you probably wouldn't want to do that is just because the amortized data set is harder to deal with. Yeah. The basic idea is that the costs that you're seeing in that in the amortized data set are, because they're not the actual thing you're paying, they're a percentage of the reservation. For you to answer the question of how much in the month of July am I paying for virtual machines, that would be a pretty challenging question to answer with just the amortized data set. So as an example, the reason being is if you were to sum all your virtual machine costs for July, you would, in the amortized data set, the cost you would see wouldn't be the cost of the virtual machines, it'd be the cost of the reservations. And from that perspective, it wouldn't be impossible, but it would be quite challenging to see the underlying data. The basic answer is, if you're comfortable enough with either data set, you can kind of cheat and get both of the data sets to show you the same thing. But basically, the reason why they exist as disparate data sets is just to make it a little bit easier to deal with each use case. Yeah, so great question.
We are running out of time, but Tammy, you are extremely passionate about this topic.
Yeah. So if you see me in Houston, Texas, if you see a black SUV in Houston, Texas with this license plate, you can wave. We're passionate about FinOps in Texas. I think there's 3 of us now. Somebody in Utah, me in Texas, and then
one of the Dakotas,
yep,
or
yep.
maybe Dakotas or Minnesota.
Exactly.
Else, so. And if you want to meet with Tammy and Jacob to ask them more questions, you can see them at the aircraft carrier.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Give them a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching that session. I'm sitting here in San Diego right after FinOps X. We hope you join us next year here live 2024. In the meantime, please subscribe to the channel and join the community. Get involved, join the summits, get in a working group, and don't forget to get FinOps certified. Because next year here in San Diego for FinOps X, it's going to be twice as big. Come join the party. Come meet your people. Welcome home.